Bleeding Kansas was a series of violent political confrontations involving anti-slavery free staters and pro-slavery border ruffian elements that took place in the Kansas Territory and the neighboring towns of Missouri between 1854 and 1861. At the heart of the conflict was the question of whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free state or slave state. As such, Bleeding Kansas was a proxy war between Northerners and Southerners over the issue of slavery in the United States. The term Bleeding Kansas was coined by Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune. The events it encompasses directly presaged the American Civil War. Congress had long struggled to balance the interests of slaveholders and abolitionists. The events later known as Bleeding Kansas were set into motion by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which nullified the Missouri Compromise and instead implemented the concept of popular sovereignty. A democratic idea, popular sovereignty stated that the inhabitants of each territory or state should decide whether it be a free state or a slave state. However, this resulted in immigration to Kansas by activists from both sides. At one point, Kansas had two separate governments, each with its own constitution, although only one was federally recognized. On January 29, 1861, Kansas was admitted to the Union as a free state less than 3 months before the Battle of Fort Sumter, which began the Civil War. The issue of slavery had been deeply embedded in the culture of the southern United States since the country's formation. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 created the Kansas and Nebraska territories and opened the lands to settlement by American pioneers. The act also established that the question of whether slavery would be allowed in the new states of Kansas and Nebraska would be decided by the inhabitants of the states, essentially repealing the Missouri Compromise. The concept of letting the settlers decide, now known as popular sovereignty, was an idea advocated by U.S. Senator Stephen A. Douglas, chairman of the Senate Committee on Territories. Popular sovereignty was an attempt to offer concessions to the southern states by making possible the expansion of slavery into both western and northern territories. While this doctrine, also known in Kansas Territory as squatter sovereignty, was not actually formulated by U.S. Senator Lewis Cass, he nevertheless earned the title Father of Popular Sovereignty. By providing its ideological framework in a letter published in the Washington Daily Union, which later also secured for Cass the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party. On the afternoon of May 22, 1856, Preston Smith Brooks, a Democratic congressman from South Carolina, physically attacked Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts in the Senate chambers, hitting him on the head with his thick cane. Sumner was blinded by his own blood and staggered away until he collapsed, lapsing into unconsciousness. Brooks continued to beat Sumner until he broke his cane. Several other senators attempted to help Sumner, but was blocked by Representative Lawrence Keep, who was holding a pistol and shouting, "Let them be!" This was in retaliation for insulting language Sumner used against Brooks' relative in a speech Sumner made that denounced Southerners for pro-slavery violence in Kansas. Sumner was beaten severely and did not return to his Senate desk for another 3 years as a result of his injuries into the head and neck area. He became regarded as an anti-slavery martyr. Preston Brooks attacking Charles Sumner in the U.S. Senate of 1856. These acts, in turn, inspired John Brown to lead a group of men in Kansas Territory on an attack at pro-slavery settlement at Osawatomie Creek. During the night of May 24th, the group, which included 4 of Brown's sons, led 5 pro-slavery men from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. Brown's men let Jerome Glanville and James Harris return home to the cabin of Harris. In August, thousands of pro-slavery men formed into armies and marched into Kansas. That same month, Brown and several of his followers engaged 400 pro-slavery soldiers in the Battle of Osawatomie. The hostiles raged for another 2 months until Brown departed the Kansas Territory and a new territorial governor, John W. Geary, took office and managed to prevail upon both sides for peace. This was followed by a fragile peace broken by intermittent violence outbreaks for 2 more years. The last major outbreak of violence was touched off by the Mariah Day's Cygnus Massacre in 1858, where border ruffians killed 5 free statemen. In all, approximately 56 people died in Bleeding Kansas by the time the violence completely abated in 1859. Following the commencement of the American Civil War in 1861, additional guerrilla violence erupted on the border between Kansas and Missouri.